She counted her last coins twice before she let herself believe the number, enough for one plate, not two. She set it down in front of her son anyway, smoothed his hair back, and told him the same lie she told him a dozen times that month, soft, steady, like it cost her nothing at all. Eat, sweetheart. I'm not hungry, he believed her. He was 8, she'd never once given him a reason not to. But across that small farmhouse diner, a rancher eating alone at a corner table watched her hands stay folded in her lap through the entire meal. And recognized something in that particular stillness he hadn't seen since he was younger than the boy across from her. He knew that lie, his own mother had told it to him more times than he'd ever managed to forget. What none of them knew yet was that the worst winter Wyoming Territory had seen in a generation was already building somewhere north of the Bighorns, and it was coming for all 3 of them before. Spring. If you've ever watched someone you love push their plate a little further away and swear they weren't hungry, stay with this one all the way through. It's about to ask you a question you might not be ready for. Jacob Coleman had filed on his homestead the same year he married Sarah, 160 acres.
You are such a good
Claimed
helper.
Clean under the government's promise that hard work alone could turn raw prairie into a life worth keeping. For 6 years it had, then came the winter that broke half the ranchers in the territory. Old-timers were already calling it the big die-up before the snow even finished falling, the worst cattle winter Wyoming had lived through in memory. Stock found frozen standing upright in the coulees clear into April, whole herds simply gone. Jacob lost most of his cattle that winter. He borrowed heavy against the homestead to rebuild the herd the following spring, and never fully recovered before a fever took him the autumn after. The Homestead Act had promised Sarah a claim of her own back when she and Jacob first staked it together. It offered her nothing now that he was gone and the note was called due. A widow's name on a filing didn't count for much against a bank holding her husband's signature. Sarah signed the papers surrendering the land with a steadiness that surprised even the banker handling it. She didn't cry in front of Noah. She made a private rule about that the day Jacob died. And she kept it the day the bank took the farm too, packing what little they could carry into a single trunk and setting out toward Cheyenne Crossing before winter closed the roads. The wagon rides they could afford were short and rare. Most days Sarah and Noah walked, her trunk balanced on a borrowed handcart, the 200 miles between Larkin and Cheyenne Crossing longer and colder than either of them had bargained for. October in Wyoming didn't forgive a poor coat. By the 4th night, the temperature dropped hard enough that Sarah abandoned the open road and pushed them both into an old, half-collapsed line shack she'd spotted off the trail, its roof mostly caved, but enough standing wall left to break the wind. She built the smallest fire she dared, fed it slow, and held Noah against her chest the whole night, listening to coyotes somewhere out past the dark and praying the fire held till morning. "Your hands are cold, Mama," Noah said, half asleep against her. "So are yours," she said, and didn't say the rest of what she was thinking, that a woman could go quiet in her sleep in weather like this if she wasn't careful. And that she'd rather freeze than wake and find her son had. She rationed what little food they carried with a brutal arithmetic that would follow her to every plate for the next year of her life. Bread first, always, for Noah. She told him it was a game some nights, seeing who could make supper last longest, and let him win every time without him ever suspecting the game existed for his benefit alone. They reached a small farmhouse diner 2 days outside Cheyenne Crossing on a cold afternoon. Sarah's coins counted and recounted the whole walk-up from the road. Inside smelled of wood smoke and fried salt pork, cornbread baking. Chicory coffee bitter on the air, the kind of frontier cooking that stretched a little meat and a lot of grain into something that filled a working man's belly for a nickel a plate. Noah's eyes went wide with a hunger he was too young to fully hide. Sarah studied the chalked menu board a long moment, doing arithmetic she already knew the answer to before she finished the sum. "1 plate, please, for my son. Nothing for yourself, ma'am. I ate before we came in." The lie came smooth from long practice. The plate arrived heaped with salt pork, beans, and a wedge of cornbread, more food than Noah had seen at one sitting in weeks. Sarah set it in front of him with a smile that cost her more than the coins had. "Eat, sweetheart, I'm not hungry." Noah paused halfway through to offer her a forkful anyway, the way he always did. "I'm fine," Sarah said, gently pushing his hand back. "You finish it." She folded her hands in her lap and watched him eat, giving no sign at all of what her own stomach was doing beneath the table. Thomas Riley sat alone at a corner table that same afternoon, in from his ranch for winter supplies, and found his attention drawn again and again to the woman and boy near the window. He'd noticed the single plate first. He'd noticed her folded hands and the particular way she watched her son eat, like she was counting every bite that mattered more than her own hunger. He knew that posture. He'd watched his own mother hold it at their kitchen table more winters than he cared to remember. Back when a bad cattle season had left his family thin for more than one hard year, claiming she wasn't hungry so often that Thomas hadn't understood until he was nearly grown. That it had never once been true. He didn't approach right away. He finished his own meal slowly, watching, turning an idea over that felt the longer he sat with it, less like charity and more like simple good sense. When Sarah rose to pay, Thomas rose too and crossed the room before he could talk himself out of it. "Ma'am," he said, removing his hat, "didn't mean to intrude." "Couldn't help overhearing you're headed toward Cheyenne Crossing." "We are," Sarah said, careful and guarded. "I run a ranch about 6 miles east of here. Lost my cook back in September to her daughter's wedding, and I've been eating my own terrible cooking ever since. My hired hands complain about it daily. I could use someone in the kitchen. Room's simple but warm and the wages fair. Your boy would have his own bed. Not a bedroll on some road." Sarah weighed the offer against every hard lesson the past year had taught her about strangers and their generosity. "Why us?" "You don't know anything about me. I know you can stretch a coin further than most folks I've met," Thomas said plainly, no pity in it, just observation. That's exactly the kind of sense a working kitchen needs, especially with the winter the old-timers are already predicting. It wasn't charity the way he offered it. And Sarah recognized the careful construction of that for exactly what it was. "I'll earn every meal," she said, "with my own hands." "Wouldn't expect anything less," Thomas said. "Weather's turning fast this year. Best we get you and the boy settled before the first real storm hits." Thomas's ranch house smelled of wood smoke and worn leather and horse sweat, ordinary smells that meant nothing to most people and meant everything to a woman who'd spent 3 weeks smelling only trail dust and her own quiet desperation. The low farmhouse and its scattering of outbuildings sat against the wide Wyoming sky like something built to last, sturdy in a way the road hadn't been. The small room off the kitchen that became Sarah and Noah's held a real bed, a real stove, and walls that didn't let the wind straight through. Sarah threw herself into the kitchen work with fierce, quiet determination, up before dawn to have breakfast ready, meals stretched carefully but never noticeably thin. Every task done twice as thoroughly as required. She wouldn't accept help carrying the heavy stock pots. She wouldn't accept a second helping at supper, no matter how plainly Thomas or the hands offered. "You work harder than anyone on this ranch," Thomas told her one evening. "You're allowed to sit down once in a while, Mrs. Coleman. I'll sit when the work's done. Work's never entirely done on a ranch." That's the nature of it. She didn't have a ready answer, mostly because some old, careful part of her still believed that the moment she stopped proving her usefulness, the ground beneath her and Noah would give way again, the same sudden way it had the year Jacob died. What Sarah didn't know that autumn was that Noah had started keeping a promise of his own, one made at his father's bedside the week Jacob died and never spoken aloud since. "Take care of your mama," Jacob had told him, voice thin with fever. "She won't ask for help even when she needs it most. You watch out for her, Eli, promise me." Noah had promised, and he'd kept it the only way an 8-year-old boy knew how, by watching, by noticing. By never once telling his mother he'd seen through every "I'm not hungry" she'd offered him since. Sometime in November, watching wasn't enough anymore, so Noah started doing something about it. Small things at first. A heel of cornbread slipped into his coat pocket at breakfast instead of finished. Half a biscuit tucked under his pillow at supper, saved for later. He didn't fully understand why he was doing it, only that some quiet, stubborn part of him had decided that if his mother wouldn't take food for herself, he'd find a way to have some ready for her anyway, for the night she finally needed it more than her pride could argue with. By December, the little collection under a loose floorboard in his room had grown into something almost embarrassing: dried biscuit ends, a twist of salt pork rind, a hard little knot of cornbread gone stale. He didn't touch it himself, not even on the hungriest nights, because in his mind it wasn't his. It was hers whenever she'd finally let herself have it. He told no one, not even Thomas, not yet. It was, in its own small way, exactly the same lie his mother told at every table. "I don't need this, it's fine, don't worry about me," except Noah's version ran in the opposite direction. A boy quietly stockpiling proof that someone in that house had been paying attention the whole time, waiting for the moment his mother would finally need it laid bare in front of her. The blizzard came down out of the Bighorns the second week of January, and it did not behave like any storm the hired hands had seen in years. It snowed 3 days straight, then held cold and still for a week, then snowed again, temperatures dropping so far below freezing that the water troughs froze solid twice a day, no matter how often the ice was broken. Thomas and the hands worked from before dawn until well past dark, trying to push cattle down out of the exposed high pasture. Still, morning after morning, they found stock frozen where it stood, the same brutal pattern that had already killed half the territory's herds that decade. "We're going to lose a third of the herd if this doesn't break soon," Thomas admitted to Sarah one night, too exhausted to guard the worry in his voice. "Maybe more. What happens if we do? Same thing that happened to half the ranchers in this territory the winter your husband lost his herd," Thomas said. "A man loses his cattle, he loses his income. Everybody depending on that ranch feels it come spring." Sarah understood exactly what that meant better than most and said nothing more that night, though she began, without telling him, quietly stretching the pantry supplies even further than she already had. The old careful arithmetic of hunger returning to her hands like it had never left. By the 4th week of the storm, supplies at the ranch had thinned enough that Sarah's old habits, worn deep from a year on the road, resurfaced without her deciding to let them. She served Noah first, generous portions despite the shrinking stores, and cut her own share smaller each week. Telling herself the hands needed their strength more than she did, telling herself the same careful lies she'd told a stranger in a diner months earlier. Thomas noticed. He noticed the particular way she stirred a thin stew longer than it needed, giving herself an excuse to stay near the stove instead of the table. He noticed the color leaving her face by the 3rd week, faint but unmistakable to a man who'd watched his own mother go the same pale, careful gray one hard winter. "Sarah," he said one evening, catching her alone in the kitchen, "how long has it been since you had a full plate? There's not much extra to go around right now. You know that better than anyone. There's enough for you not to be the one going without," Thomas said. "I need you standing on your own 2 feet through this storm, not fading out from under me because you decided everybody else's hunger mattered more than yours." Sarah didn't answer that right away. The old fear rising sharp and familiar in her chest, the fear that had followed her since the day Jacob first fell ill. Thomas started finding small, careful ways to close the gap without ever naming it directly, aware that Sarah's pride would refuse anything that looked too much like pity offered outright. He claimed, more often than the truth likely supported, that he'd cooked too much stew and needed help finishing it before it spoiled. He mentioned the hands preferred bigger portions and she oughtn't shortchange herself just because she was serving from the same thinning pot. He carved off a larger cut of the last salt pork some mornings before she'd noticed him doing it, and never once drew attention to the gesture when she did. "You're a terrible liar about leftover stew," Sarah told him one night, catching him at it plainly. "There's no possible way you made that much extra." "Not with the stores this thin," Thomas didn't deny it. "Eat it anyway." "Thomas, Sarah," he said, using her given name deliberately. "You spent a year making sure your son never went without, on a road that should have killed you both twice over. I'd like the chance to make sure, in whatever small way you'll let me, that you don't have to keep doing that alone anymore. Storm or no storm, She didn't have a response ready, her eyes suddenly bright in the lamplight, and she ate the stew without further argument, though it took her longer than usual to finish it. "Do you like it here, Noah?" Thomas asked him one evening, mending harness together while the storm howled outside. "I like it a lot," Noah said. "Better than I've liked anywhere since Pa died. Your mama seems to like it too." Noah considered that seriously. "She still doesn't eat enough," he said, quiet and matter-of-fact, the words slipping out before he'd fully decided to share them. "She thinks I don't notice. I promised Pa I'd watch out for her." "I've been watching this whole time." Thomas went still at that. Noah hesitated, then reached into his coat and drew out, a little sheepishly, a small cloth bundle he'd carried down from his room that evening without quite admitting to himself why. He unfolded it on the workbench between them, dried biscuit ends, a twist of salt pork rind, a hard knot of cornbread gone stale with age. "I've been saving it," Noah said, "since November for her. In case there's ever a night there's nothing left and she says she's not hungry again, and I know that's a lie." He looked up. "I didn't know what else to do. I'm not big enough to fix the ranch or the money. But I could do this." Thomas looked at that small, sad collection of hoarded scraps, a boy's entire understanding of how to protect his mother. Laid out on a workbench in the middle of a blizzard, and felt something tighten hard in his chest that had nothing to do with the cold outside. "You kept that promise to your father better than most grown men manage in a lifetime," Thomas said, and meant every word of it. "Can I tell you something, Noah? You don't have to carry this alone anymore either. That's not just your job now. It's mine too, if your mother will let me." Noah studied him a long moment, the way children study adults deciding whether to trust them completely. Then he nodded and carefully folded the little bundle back up, not because he didn't believe Thomas, but because some promises once made don't get put down easily, they just, if you're lucky, finally get some help carrying them. The storm finally broke the first week of February, and what it left behind told its own hard story. Thomas and the hands rode the exposed pasture for 2 full days counting losses, and the final tally came in worse than even his worst fear, nearly 40 head gone. Frozen in the coulees the same way half the territory's herds had gone that decade. A blow that would strain the ranch's finances clean through the following year. "We'll manage," Thomas told the hands, though the numbers sat heavy in his own chest the rest of that week. He'd weathered lean years before. He knew exactly how thin a margin the ranch would run on now and how little room there was for any further trouble to land on his doorstep. Trouble found him anyway. The second week after the thaw, in the shape of a rider coming up the lane with papers in his coat, and 2 armed men from the Larkin Sheriff's office riding behind him. Silas Crow didn't bother dismounting this time. "Banks reviewed the matter further, Mrs. Coleman," he said, papers already in hand. "Your husband's note carried a personal guarantee that survives the homestead's surrender. We're here to collect against wages owed you at this ranch and against livestock belonging to Mr. Riley here, given the debts now attached to your continued employment. You've got no legal claim on my cattle," Thomas said, stepping onto the porch, voice flat and even. "I've got a signed judgment from the Larkin court," Crow said, "and 2 deputized men behind me who will see it enforced today, Mr. Riley, unless you'd rather make this difficult." Thomas didn't move from the porch. Didn't reach for the Winchester leaning just inside the door, though every man present understood plainly that he could. "You lost 40 head this winter, same as every rancher in this territory," Thomas said. "Same as the herd that broke Jacob Coleman and left his widow with nothing but a debt you're now trying to collect twice over, once from a dead man's land and once from his son's supper table. I'd think carefully before you push a ranch already bled thin by the worst winter this territory's seen in a decade." Crow's certainty flickered just slightly at the mention of the winter's toll. Sarah stood frozen in the doorway through the entire exchange. Watching a debt she'd carried alone for a year threaten to cost Thomas everything he'd rebuilt through the hardest winter of his own life. That night, once Crow had ridden off promising to return with a formal writ, Sarah reached the same conclusion she'd arrived at alone so many times before, that the safest way to protect the people she loved was to remove herself before she became the reason they suffered for it. She began packing the small trunk again, in the dark, moving with the same careful economy of motion she'd used on the road from Larkin. "Where are we going, Mama?" Noah asked, finding her folding his shirts. "Somewhere new," Sarah said, the same words she'd used months earlier, though her voice shook this time in a way it hadn't before. "Just for a little while, sweetheart. I won't let this debt cost Thomas his ranch, not after everything he's already lost this winter." Noah studied her a long moment, and for the first time in his life, he did not simply believe her. He found Thomas in the barn that same night, breathless from running the whole way. "Mama's packing," he said. "She thinks I don't know we're leaving again." Thomas set down the tack he'd been mending. "Why would she leave, Noah?" "Because of the money, Mr. Riley. She thinks it'll hurt you if she stays." Tears threatened now, the fear finally finding its way out of him whole. "I promised Pa I'd watch out for her before he died. He told me she'd never ask for help, even when she needed it most. And he was right. She's been doing it since before he died. She always says she's not hungry when the food isn't enough. She said it in that diner. She's still doing it now, even here, even in the storm. She thinks I never noticed. I always noticed. Every single time." Thomas felt something break open in his chest, the full weight of every careful, silent sacrifice Sarah had made, finally laid plain by the one person who'd watched it happen from the very beginning. "Show me where she is," he said, "right now. And Noah, you kept that promise to your father better than most grown men manage in a lifetime." He found Sarah at the trunk. And this time, when Crow's writ arrived 3 days later with the same 2 deputized men behind him, Sarah was standing on that porch beside Thomas, rather than halfway to Cheyenne Crossing. "I've spoken with a lawyer out of Cheyenne," Thomas said, before Crow had even finished dismounting. "Territorial law is clear enough on this once you read past the first page, Mr. Crow. A personal guarantee doesn't survive a homestead's full surrender the way your bank's been claiming it does, not without a separate signed instrument nobody's produced yet. You've been threatening a widow with a debt that was never enforceable past the land itself." Crow's confidence finally cracked in full. "That's a matter for the court to decide." "Then take it to the court," Thomas said, still and unmoving, the Winchester resting easy but visible in the crook of his arm. "But you'll do it without touching a single head of my cattle, or a single dollar of Mrs. Coleman's wages today. I've buried enough this winter without burying my patience for men who prey on widows for a living." Crow studied the rifle, studied the set of Thomas's jaw, and found, for the first time since he'd started riding out to that ranch, that his certainty had nowhere left to stand. He rode off without another word and never returned. "I've watched you put Noah's plate ahead of your own for a year now," Thomas said that evening, the danger finally past. "I understand why. I watched my own mother do it most of my childhood. And I understand exactly what it costs a person to keep doing it quietly, winter after winter, without ever asking for a single thing in return. It's not something I know how to stop," Sarah admitted. "Then let me help you learn," Thomas said, "not because you need saving, Sarah. Because you've spent so long making sure Noah never went without that you forgot you're allowed a full plate too." Sarah looked at him a long moment, this careful, steady man who'd noticed an empty plate in a roadside diner and rearranged his whole household, and stood on his own porch with a rifle to make sure it never happened again. "I'd like that," she said finally, her voice thick but certain. That evening at supper, Sarah served herself first for the first time since anyone could remember, her plate every bit as full as her son's. Noah noticed, smiled, and kept eating, the quiet, patient watchfulness of a promise finally allowed to rest. Later that night, once Noah had gone to bed, he took the small cloth bundle out from under his floorboard one last time, not to hide it again, but to finally show his mother what he'd been carrying all winter. He set it on the kitchen table in front of her without a word. Sarah unfolded it slowly, looked at the dried biscuit ends, the twist of salt pork rind, the hard little knot of stale cornbread, a whole season of an 8-year-old boy's love, saved crumb by crumb against the night she finally needed it. "Noah," she started and couldn't finish the sentence. "I know you always say you're not hungry," Noah said. "I just wanted there to be something ready for whenever that wasn't true." He looked down at the table. I'm sorry, it's not much. Sarah pulled her son into her arms right there in the kitchen and held him the way she'd held him that first freezing night in the lined shack, except this time there was nothing left to be afraid of. And she let herself cry in front of him for the first time since Jacob died, because some promises, she understood now, aren't meant to be carried alone, not by a mother. And not by an 8-year-old boy either. A year later, when the first hard frost came down out of the bighorns again, the ranch was ready for it in a way it hadn't been the winter before Storehouse Fuller. Herd rebuilt slow and careful, Thomas and Sarah married that September in a ceremony small enough to fit the whole of it on the porch where Crow had once stood with his papers and his empty threats. Noah, 9 years old now and an inch taller, still kept a small tin under his bed, not scraps of hoarded food anymore, but a boy's private collection of favorite things. Because Thomas had told him once that a person's allowed to keep watching out for the people they love without it having to cost them something every time. On the first night of that second winter's storm, Sarah set the supper table with 3 full plates instead of 2, without having to think about the arithmetic at all. Noah ate his fill. Thomas ate his. And Sarah, watching them both across a table finally free of any careful, silent math, ate every bite of her own plate too, and didn't once tell anyone she wasn't hungry. Because for the first time in longer than she could measure, it wouldn't have been true. Outside, the same wind that had once nearly taken everything from them moved harmlessly across a ranch that had, against every hard winter Wyoming Territory could throw at it, finally learned how to hold